Wasn't even on. This is so fucking stressful trying to get all this stuff figured out. Oh my god. There's like a million different things you have to do to stream on Twitch. Why don't they just make it easy? Oh my fucking god. Hey everybody. Enough complaining. How's it going? I'm Jack. Nice Friday night here in the United Kingdom, in the gloomy United Kingdom. I'm going to be doing what any normal person would do. I'm going to be talking about some capital. And specifically, as I think you can see, I'm going to be talking about this business here. Chapter 29, Genesis of the Capitalist Farmer, and just kind of primitive accumulation in general. I, as real heads will know, real auxiliary statements heads, haven't finished Capital yet. I'm a buffoon. I'm a wannabe Marxist. What are you going to do? But to be fair, dear listener, dear viewer, I got about 15 pages left. And I could just finish it tonight. Got about that much left. This is not that much. That's volume 2. Fuck that. That's going to take me years. That much. I got that much left. Very excited to actually finish it. I've been working on it, on reading it for about, I don't know, 2 years, 2.5 years now, something like that. And the reason for that, I guess, is I have a job and a life. I'm not an academic, and don't really have a lot of time to do this stuff, but also more importantly, maybe just kind of want to understand it. I kind of want to take my time. I don't really just want to plow through it and be like, yeah, I've read Capital and have no idea really what I'm talking about. So I've really been kind of trying to go through it, understand what our friend Marx is talking about, which takes some effort. Sorry, I'm on a busy intersection. It's just going to be fucking loud at some points. Really understand what he's talking about, and I've kind of gotten like halfway there. I don't know, to actually understand what he's talking about. It isn't really that complicated once you get past the first couple chapters. That really took me and Dan a while to like really understand what he's on about with the commodity stuff. But once you do, it's like, oh, okay. And then it just builds from there. And it's relatively straightforward. That isn't to say that it's not maddening, because it definitely is. But really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. And so the reason I wanted to stream a bit tonight was to actually talk about his chapters on primitive accumulation. As I said, I haven't finished it yet, so he finishes with, maybe I can pull, how do I do this? Show the navigation panels, pull this up, go there, get rid of that, get rid of this. Where we're at right now, this is the first volume, is right towards the end. So Part 7 is like the good stuff. This is where he like really gets into what he wants to talk about and what he's building up with all of this abstract labor stuff, all of this use value shenanigans. And he really like makes his argument about the way that he thinks that capitalism functions, all things being equal. And I think the all things being equal bit is very important, because as he, says, not all things are equal. So in a kind of like, given economy, the way that an economy actually functions. But this is how it should function, right? This is the way that all other things being equal, supply, demand, all of these other factors, this is the way it functions. It's really good. I got to go back through and really understand more of it, or make an effort to understand more of it. Because it's dense. I hate to say it, folks, but you heard it here first. Capital is, in fact, dense. And so now we're on Part 8, Primitive Accumulation. And this stuff rocks. This is like the best stuff in the entire book for me, at least. I mean, it's obviously not the best stuff to understanding how capitalism works, which is maybe like the point of this whole book, but I love this stuff. People will know that Dan and I love talking about on the show the kind of like Brenner debate stuff. That's kind of how we started the show. Is one of the first things we read was Ellen Meakson's Wood, classic. Her treatise on the whole like contribution to the Brenner debate stuff, Origin of Capitalism. Oh, it's called The Origin of Capitalism. It's on The Origin of Capitalism. And she puts forward like this very compelling view of the way that capitalism originated, really saying to people, if you want to understand how it originated, you can't focus on the quantitative increases in trade, right? Because that stuff's always been there. We've always had trade, and there's been smatterings of wage labor every now and then, but you really got to focus on what she calls like this qualitative difference in labor relations, which is like the change in the way that the producing class relates to the expropriating class, the ruling class. And it's very compelling. It's very, very good. But I will say, going through this stuff in Capital, it's like what everybody says, right? It's like if you want to understand Marx, just fucking read Marx. It sucks having to do it. It takes a lot of time, and you got to use your noggin. But like, I'm really impressed with what he puts forward here in these first few chapters of Part 8, and I'm just gonna go through a little bit of it with you all. So hopefully that's okay. How do I get back to this? I think I do that. So we'll start with Chapter 9 here, and I'm just gonna kind of walk you through some of the stuff that blew my mind. So let me pull this up. I've actually got my fucking copy here, and I've got all of my notes in here, my mad scrollings in here. They don't really make a whole lot of sense. We'll see if I can actually talk about it. But I think the thing that really blew my mind reading this is that you really understand, oh, okay, the origin of capitalism is very much like a process, right? It's not like I don't know, it's very easy to fall into the trap of being like, if you're like a real Brenner head, you'll go, it was the 17th century, it was in England, it was those syphilitic, sicko, nobility people turning into big farmers, kicking people off the lands, it's the enclosures. It was the 17th century and it was in England. That is where capitalism originated. Or if you're like a Wallerstein guy, right, like you'll say, I don't know, whenever Wallerstein says, earlier than that, because he's generally a bit more interested in the like quantitative increase and how that leads to like a world system, which I find really interesting, and I think something that is necessary to engage with, absolutely, even if I don't necessarily agree with it like 100%. And yeah, and so he would probably say a bit earlier, right? Like with the discovery of the New World, all of this stuff. And other Marxists, I forget the guy's name, who's like really puts forward that no, it was the Italian city-states. They were the ones who originated capitalism, or whatever. They were the ones who started it. It was like Florence or whatever, or Milan. I don't know. Presumably like Venice as well. If you can't tell, actually, I haven't really engaged with that stuff too much. I should. And what Marx is putting forward here is he's really saying, like, yeah, it is a process. And there are a number of different things that have to happen in order for capitalism to become a thing. And that's what has blown my mind the most. So in this bit, right at the beginning, in the chapters before this, he's kind of talking about the primitive accumulation and how it relates to the laboring class and how we kind of get a working class. Because, like, importantly, one of the main things that he's driving at in this, and it is my understanding that he does this, he expands on this a lot more in Volume 2, although I don't know, because that's going to take me another 5 years to get to that, is this idea that, MCM prime, all of this stuff, the capitalist business cycle, accumulating capital, is a circuit, right? It's not necessarily circular. You'll hear it described as like a spiral because you got your money. If you're a capitalist, you invest, you create this commodity, and then you get more money and capital out the other end than what you invested in it. And that you just keep going. It's not like that ends at any point, right? And so Marx says, like, if you're looking for the origin of capitalism and you're following that logic, it's going to be kind of impossible, because you're going to kind of go, okay, if you need what's like the prerequisite for a capitalist class, well, it's exploiting surplus value. Okay, so what do you need if you're exploiting surplus value? Well, you need a laboring class that operates on the split between necessary labor time and surplus value. Okay, but that presupposes a capitalist class, and then you just get caught up in the circle, right? So this idea of primitive accumulation for him is then a way to kind of get past that circular thinking and to kind of go, okay, well, there must have been something at the beginning that allowed for the necessary accumulation of a working class and a capitalist class to then usher in capitalism, and then to get that, like, what Andreas Malm, and wherever his book is, somewhere around here, the book that I should be reading right now that I'm not reading for next week's show, I think he calls self-expanding value or something like that. It's this idea, right, of like the capitalist circuit, MCM prime, MCM prime, MCM prime, right? And so, yeah, Section 8 is Marx's kind of like, explanation for how you get to that first point. And what I think is really interesting is, let me see if I can find it quickly. Oh yeah, here it is. I can get this out. Dropped my Space Marine, my World Eater Space Marines. Excellent kill team. Look at that. Expertly painted. Well, you can't really see it too well. I have a very shitty webcam. What are you going to do? When we talk about primitive accumulation, the one time that this has come up on the show before, we've talked about it a number of times, but in earnest, is with Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Excellent book. We never finished it for the show, but read it. It's good stuff. It's sad. It's very sad stuff. But it's like, what are you going to do? Be a prick and not understand the suffering of the new world? Don't be that guy. You don't want to be that person. That sucks. But anyway, Galeano discusses primitive accumulation in like I hate to say it, but like very vulgar way. He thinks of primitive accumulation as like, and this is the kind of like modern Marxist understanding of it, I hate to say it, that you hear talked about a lot. Primitive accumulation is just how did the capitalists get enough money to then buy up enough land to then have, kick people off of their agricultural, kick the peasants off of their land, to then have this like vagrant working class free labor meeting the owners of the means of production. It's basically like it's a quantitative way in which you get enough money to then buy the means of production and employ a working class. That's very vulgar. That is not what primitive accumulation is, or at least that's not what Marx says it is. You can have your own opinions, of course. I tend to agree with Marx here. Primitive accumulation is much more. Primitive accumulation isn't just how do you get enough money, dude. How does the ruling class, the nobility, get enough money so that it can then become the capitalist ruling class? That's too simplistic. I guess the money question is part of it, right? But much more so, primitive accumulation, as Marx uses it, is like a way of understanding how enough labor, it's basically a way of understanding how did a quote-unquote free laborer, as opposed to like a peasant, which is not free, right? They're just tied to the land or whatever. How did a free laborer meet in the marketplace with someone who owns the means of production, and will then go on to become a capitalist, right? It's like, how does that thing happen? And the thing that's blowing my mind is that Marx says that a number of things have to happen in order for that to happen, and it simply isn't just a question of the enclosures, right? So he says here, I'm just going to read off of my copy, but reading this, where are we? Yeah, this bit. And just a warning, in times past when I have tried to highlight on this PDF reader, it has just crashed before. And also, I'm having bad internet issues as well, so I might just fucking disappear. What are you going to do? I'm doing my best. Also turn my phone off. Should have done that before this. Basically, Marx says, now that we have considered the forcible creation of a class of outlawed proletarians, love it, the bloody discipline that turned them into wage laborers, the disgraceful action of the state which employed the police to accelerate the accumulation of capital by increasing the degree of exploitation of labor, the question then remains, where did the capitalists come from? So in the chapter before this, which I should probably actually, is it the chapter before this? I think it is the chapter before this. No, it is not. Let's go to the chapter before this. Look at all these fucking footnotes, Marx. This is bad formatting. The footnotes should be at the end of the entire document. Sorry, hate to say it. That's a pet peeve of mine. So, just to explain the kind of primitive accumulation of the laborer a little bit. Whoa, I don't want that. This bit here, ignore that T. There we go. Marx puts forward like a number of different ways in which the peasants' land was kind of like taken from them, right? And they were forced into like vagrancy, where they then had to go into the towns and then had to become wage laborers, as opposed to someone who always owned their own means of production, which I guess is just like scythes and shovels and like a plow or something like that. Some oxen, perhaps. Manure. They were digging at this point, which I don't like. Tilling the soil, I should say. Marx puts forward here like what, 4, I think, reasons how this happened. Where are we at here? I think 4. Just hear the flipping of my pages. Yeah, so he says in that paragraph that church property being destroyed was a huge part of this, right? And so I'll go through all 4 of them. He says there was church property being destroyed, and in England, this is like the easiest thing in the world to see how this happened. In more liberal kind of histories, you get this idea that like, the enlightened monarch Henry VIII or whatever, like shut down the monasteries because this was just the enlightened progress of history. Of course, that's the most idealistic thing on the planet. That's not actually why it happened. But regardless, this opened up huge swaths of land to new owners, basically, because it's like shutting down the monasteries. if anybody owns a lot of land, it's the church, right? In like Western Europe, or just Europe, I guess, in general. But yeah, specifically in England, that's the way in which church's property was destroyed. He talks about state domains being opened up to like, even though this is like not the correct terminology, to like the private sphere, right? Basically, alienation of state domains is, I think, what he calls it here. The fraudulent alienation of state domains. Love it. The robbery of the commons. This is the saddest one, of course. If you listen to the show, you know Dan and I lament the tragedy of the commons. Or not the tragedy of the commons, the loss of the commons. This is basically like the system in which the peasants used to work their land. A very large portion of like land around everybody was used by, oh my God, there's a thing. I should probably make that bigger, shouldn't I? A very large proportion of land around the peasant commune, or whatever you want to call it, was used communally, right? And it was used so that you could go and graze your sheep or graze your goats, and you just let them go out there, and nobody actually owned it. It wasn't anybody's specific land, but it was used by everybody, right? So through reasons we're not going to get into here, all of that land was given up to the market eventually, and peasants were kicked off of it, basically through this dynamic of class conflict that existed between the nobility and the other schmucks. Oh wow, look at that. That's somebody offering me a really great promotion. Wow. Promotion for our channel. I don't think so, buddy. And so yeah, tragedy, not the tragedy of the commons. I keep calling it the tragedy of the commons, but the ways in which that peasant common land was given up was very vital to the development of capitalism. And then finally, he says feudal and clan property was usurped. I love the different ways in which he basically he like had his thesaurus out when he was basically talking about, stuff being stolen or whatever. He's like, I can't keep using the word stolen. I have to use different words. Feudal and clan property was usurped. So let me just get rid of this. Is there a way I can get rid of that? I don't know. Maybe not. Regardless, this is basically like up in Scotland, or if we're specifically talking about like what's now the United Kingdom, like in Ireland or in Scotland, like typical hereditary property by like Celtic, I don't know, clansmen or whatever, not clansmen, whatever they would be called, like chieftains or something, was taken and was eventually put up for grabs by the bourgeoisie. So those are kind of like four ways in which Marx says this primitive accumulation of the laboring workforce was created, right? So he says, what does he say here? He said they conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made the soil part and parcel of capital, and created the town industries, the necessary supply of a free, again, quotation marks, an outlawed proletariat. And the kind of really interesting thing about this is he talks a lot about how, like, the state's role in all of this. And, you always get the lament, like, oh, Marx never wrote about the state. He was going to write something big about the state. No, he never did. And we'll never know what he thought about the state. That's kind of fake news. He talks about the state quite a bit because you need to if you're actually talking about, like, the political economy of how capitalism works. But he just doesn't go into it in super in-depth detail. It's a good example in this chapter where he talks about, like, the laws that different places had in regards to vagrants. And so if you know anything about the enclosures or about all of this stuff about peasants being kicked off of their land, eventually what happened was peasants, deprived of their one way that they could make a living and, like produce enough for themselves to survive, just basically became vagrants. And there are firsthand accounts in histories of these people just like wandering around the countryside en masse. And it ain't pretty and it ain't great. A lot of these people died, but a lot of them became like criminals, I guess. Although, can you really call a person a criminal if they're just like, I've been kicked off of my land, I need food, I'm going to steal it? A lot of the laws that were put into place in and around England and in France and in a bunch of different places in Europe about how it was like the death penalty if you were a vagrant, which is like so brutal. So basically that's Marx saying that the state really violently ripped these people from their lands and then like forced them to become free proletariats, right? Isn't that great? You can sell your own labor on the market. Isn't that going to be great? Not that chapter. So then that's basically all I wanted to talk about in terms of the primitive accumulation of the proletariat. So if we go back to this chapter, where did the capitalists come from? Indeed, Marx, where did the capitalists come from? here he talks about how, again, we need to understand that this is a really slow process, and that any attempt to kind of periodize this stuff, well, you can periodize it, but any attempts to basically say this is the origin of capitalism, as I hate to say it, but I think the Brenner stuff kind of does actually fall into a little bit. They are very nuanced, and they're the best, at least that I've come across at this, but like, there's no real one place that you can say capitalism originating there, because it's a process, and that process obviously comes out of the broader process of history. So in thinking of this one specific time as there being like a specific origin of capitalism, you're kind of falling prey to like liberal historiography, which is very much like history in a vacuum, right? It's like nothing is related to anything else. Things just kind of happen, dude. And whoa, then you get like someone like Reagan who comes along and shakes things up and gets the falling rate of profit back, right? It's like, well, everything is connected to each other in history, and you need to go back. And so when Marx talks about this slow process of capitalism beginning, he is basically saying, at least to me, that like if you try and pinpoint a beginning of any of this stuff, it's going to tie into like the previous mode of production, obviously, because through to the development of prior modes of productions, mode of exploitations, whatever you want to call them, that's how, through the contradictions imbued in all of those, inherent to all of them, that's how you get your next mode of production, right? You get into a big crisis. If you're a Grossman person, then you get your final crisis or whatever, and then you got socialism or whatever. But we'll get more into that, I think, a bit later. He also says that the serfs, as well as the free proprietors, held land under very different tenures and were therefore emancipated under very different economic conditions. That's just right here. I think that's just worth pausing on because, like, yeah, very different economic conditions everywhere, right? Like, Dan and I read George Camino's book on the French Revolution, which is up there somewhere. Yeah, I see it. I'm not going to get it down. I'll knock down more Warhammer models. And he was basically making the point that if you really want to understand the origin of capitalism in France, it's different to everywhere else. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously, because it's a different place. So that's all Marx is saying here. But again, like when he says simple stuff like this, you kind of have to go, oh, right. Like I need to kind of get my brain worms out of my brain and stop trying to have like a one-size-fits-all methodology on everything. Well, maybe not a methodology, but like, you know, you can't treat the origin of capitalism in France the same way you can treat it in England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it's a process in different economic conditions. So what's the next bit I've got underlined? A little bit later on. So basically for the rest of this paragraph, Marx kind of just talks about the different, that he kind of like traces the different types of proto-capitalists throughout history in specifically, like he's basically just talking about England here, right? And so he says that first you had the bailiff, which I had to look that up, who's basically just a serf, and he's similar to this thing in Rome. The vil is probably pronounced something like Willicus in Rome, in Latin. So I'm just going to pronounce it Villicus because I'm not an asshole. I had to look up the bailiff. I had to look up the Villicus. It's basically just kind of exactly what he says. It's like serfs who kind of produce some things, maybe for a market, but maybe not for a market. They're mainly just producing for the person they're being exploited for and keeping the rest. And then he just basically goes on and on to say that there are a bunch of different types of these proto-capitalists. There's another fucking siren going by. Hang on. It's the fuzz. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. During the second half of the 14th century, where's that up here? During the second half of the 14th century, he is displaced by a farmer whom the landlord provided with seed capital and implements. So again, he's just talking about the development of these schmuck capitalists. His condition's not very different from that of the peasant. So that's interesting. That's like, maybe there are like these two emerging classes of peasantry, which is very, very interesting. Except the only difference is that he exploits more wage labor. Okay, so that's interesting because he's basically saying that, like, yeah, peasants, I guess, could like exploit wage labor like a little bit, but it's a quantity thing, I guess, as well, which is interesting. The ways in which quantity and quality always work together is very, very interesting. There's kind of like a school of dialectical thought, I think, that kind of maybe comes from Mao, although I could be wrong about this, on his book about all this stuff, about dialectics, where like the main point of dialectics is quantitative change leads to qualitative change, which I think is, the more I think about this stuff, I think a little bit vulgar maybe, because oftentimes, yeah, it does, and as we're kind of seeing here, I suppose to a certain extent it kind of does, but it doesn't necessarily. Quantitative change does not necessarily lead to qualitative change, right? So then he goes and he talks about more of these different people. Blah, 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 blah. So long as the 15th century is the independent peasant and the farm laborer working for himself as well as for wages enrich themselves by their own labor. The circumstances of the farmer were equally mediocre. So he's basically saying not a whole lot has changed up until that point. But the agricultural revolution, which commenced in the last third of the 15th century, so like the late 1400s, and continued into the 1500s, except for its last decade, enrich them just as speedily as the improvised mash of the agricultural people. Blah, 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 blah. The good stuff is, obviously, when he talks about the usurpation of the commons. We love that. And then in this last paragraph. So, that's a thing. So, yeah. Okay, so this is an important part, too, because he basically says that a lot of farmers, specifically in England, had what are maybe called like maybe you'd call them like legacy rents or something like that. Like the leases that they paid for on the land were oftentimes as long as 99 years. So it's like, sign here. This is the rate at which you'll pay your rent or whatever, what you owe me, however they figured that out. And it'll be the same for the next 99 years. And Marx said that during this time period, when a bunch of people were smack dab in the middle of those extremely long leases, there was a fall in the value of precious metals, which is very, very important, and therefore of money. And this was extremely important in the development of the primitive accumulation of the capitalist class, right? Because this meant that in real terms, while the rent that they were paying stayed the same, and it was going to stay the same for the next 99 years, the value of money dropped pretty dramatically. And so in real terms, the rent that they were paying was way less, so they had a lot more money to do with as they pleased, right? And also because of that, there's kind of like this dual tendency there where because the value of money fell, the prices of food and the stuff that they were growing went way up. So they were basically, spending a lot less money and making a lot more money through their product. And this helped with primitive accumulation. This was just another kind of kick that helped things. So basically the last sentence of this is, thus they grew rich at the expense of both their laborers and their landlords, which I love that. That's such a good sentence. Imagine getting rich off of the labor of your landlord, the labor of your landlord. Wouldn't that be nice? No wonder, therefore, that England at the end of the 16th century had already had a class of capitalist farmers, rich, considering the circumstances of the time. So maybe not like loaded, but these people were relatively had a lot of money. That blew my mind because that's a lot earlier than I had thought about this stuff happening. And maybe that's just because Marx's historical research is maybe a bit suspect, just because now we know more about this stuff, but maybe not. I mean, periodizing the rise of a capitalist class of capitalist farmers in England in the by the end of the 16th century is kind of early to me. Maybe not that early, maybe only 50 years early, so it doesn't actually really matter that much. But I always kind of consider this, goddamn it, England starting capitalism, the rising class of capitalist farmers stuff is happening in the 1600s, so in the 17th century. But there you go, interesting stuff. And that's the entire chapter. That's it. It's that long. Every once in a while he gives you a chapter that's fucking 50 pages long, and it's just quote after quote after quote after quote from a bunch of schmucks that you have never heard of, and a bunch of charts of children are being exploited this much in this factory, and then in the next factory they're being exploited this much, and it's yeah, Marx, okay, you're a real nerd, you've done your research. But then he just hits you with a chapter 29. It's just every sentence rocks, and it's good stuff. It's all very good stuff. So another thing I thought we could look at on chapter 29, let me pull this up, is one of the resources that I've been using quite a bit to get through Capital, which all of you should be using to get through Capital. Reading Marx. It's a blog. If I pull this down, I think you can actually see the URL. Where is it? There it is. go to that URL, reading Marx. Well, maybe not that URL exactly, because that's just for the specific file of the PDF. But it's run by a guy named Ed George, and it is exactly what you want. I've used the David Harvey book on Capital Volume 1. I think it's just called Reading Capital to get through all of this, but I only found out about Ed George's Reading Marx blog recently. And I wish I knew about it earlier, because now I'm just going to have to go back and reread everything that he's written about all of Capital. And it's excellent. So he basically says the exact same things here. I'll just read a little bit of what he says. And what reading Marx is it's just literally exactly what it is, what it sounds like, what's on the tin. It's just him going through all of Marx's, the 3 volumes of Capital. I think eventually he's going to do the Grundrisse, which, like, oof, good luck. Not something I'd do. And just makes notes about all of them. And is like, here's what he's saying, here's what he means. Pulls out the relevant quotes that you need. It's really, really great. Really, really good stuff. And yeah, so he says it was the agricultural revolution which began, I'm just reading here for everybody reading along at home. It was the agricultural revolution which began in the last third of the 15th century and continued for most of the 16th, which saw a significant differentiation between the farmer and the independent peasant and the wage laborer. That's interesting. This differentiation between the farmer and the independent peasant and the wage laborer and the kind of relationship that they all share. Also, there's at one point, I don't remember if it's in this chapter or if in the next chapter, where Marx talks about peasantry would kind of, and even going into his time, kind of like come back and then go away and come back and go away. And he just attributes that to what's being grown or raised on the fields. He's like, in times where they're growing more corn, which is to probably just say wheat or oats or something like that. More peasantry comes back up, but then they basically go away again when the market decides, no, you should be raising cattle now. Because then when they raise cattle, it's like you just need a couple of schmucks to, tell the cattle to go in this field now. And so you don't need really as many people, and that's generally done by wage laborers. So then he says, this process was assisted by the usurpation of the common lands, which allowed the farmer to increase the extent of her land. Again, kind of wish everybody would just use they. I don't like when Marx says he. I don't like it when the analytical Marxists say her. It feels a bit weird. Especially when they're talking... Like, one thing I've noticed is that Andreas Malm uses her pronouns, but only when he's talking about the working class, and he uses he when he's talking about the capitalist class. And that feels very, just use they, dude. Because, I don't know, it's trying to be... good and cool and woke or whatever, but it just comes across as it's weird that you're using the pronouns for the class that's being dominated. You're using feminine pronouns for that and masculine pronouns for the one that's doing the domination. I think it comes across the exact opposite as the way these people want it to. So just use they. It's all good. Don't worry about it. But also, who cares? An additional factor in this process took place in the 16th century. A fall in the price of precious metals and hence money depressed wages and increased the price of agricultural products. While the fact that fame leases, which is basically these really long leases, right, the 99-year ones, tended to be long, that rents contracted on the basis of old monetary values fell in real terms. Excellent. I love this stuff. In history, sometimes it's just random. Sometimes a revolution happens because, the climate was bad that year and everybody went hungry, and so that's why you had a revolution that year. Or at least that's what kicked it off, right? That was the immediate impetus of it all. And here it's just there's a fall in the price of money. Although I should say, I actually don't know, and Marx doesn't explain why that happened, and I'm not sure why there was a fall in the value of, hard currency, precious metals, that is. Presumably it has something to do with the, tons of silver that were just ripped out of Mesoamerica and South America. And just the colonial system in general, perhaps. Don't actually know. It's just me spitballing. But yeah, that's basically all he says here. But yeah, go at George's Reading Marx blog. It's really, 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 really good stuff. So if I had that, go back to here. Maybe we'll skip past all of his footnotes. Maybe we'll just talk a little bit about chapter 30. Does that seem like it makes sense? I don't know. Let me see. Sorry, let me just refresh some stuff. Retweet that, put that here. So yeah, then we go into chapter 30. We can talk a little bit about this. Why not? Chapter 30, Reaction of the Agricultural Revolution on Industry, Creation of the Home Market, which is, oh man, the creation of the home market stuff is so good for industrial capital. So again, this is Marx explaining primitive accumulation is more complicated than you think. It literally isn't just, you know, the ways in which the capitalists had enough money to then buy means of production. There's quite a bit more to it than that. And this idea of the home market is something I'm going to want to talk about because it's very cool and very interesting. So, right at the beginning, this first sentence, the expropriation and expulsion of the agricultural population, which we've already basically talked about. Shame, really sad. Intermittent, but renewed again and again. And again, that's another important thing to think, not to like pause in the first sentence of this chapter. But it's important to remember that this stuff is intermittent and that history sometimes doesn't just go along this, you know, perfect arc where everything bends towards more productivity. There are different types of materialism, population, you know, birth rates, weather, things like that play into all of this. So worth noting that the origin of capitalism, on again, off again. I mean, not off, but intermittent nonetheless. Supplied, as we saw, the town industries with a massive proletarians entirely unconnected with corporate guilds and unfettered by them, which is very important because to Marx, one of the reasons that peasants were able to be kicked off of their land and shoved into towns was because the guild system had basically all but collapsed by then, which is very interesting and something I don't know too much about. So I'd like to know a bit more about it. So then a bit further down, let me see if I can find this here. It's a different translation here, so it's a bit Geoffrey St. Hilaire. Is that? Yeah, okay. And then this bit. This sentence. So he says, in spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much or more produce as before meaning as with peasants, because the revolution in the conditions of landed property was concentrations of the means of production, etc., blah, 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 because not only, Jesus Christ, were the agricultural wage laborers put on the strain more intensely. So he's basically saying you might be tempted to just think that the reason that capitalists were able to get more from the soil without kind of betterment of the productive forces, without an increase in the productivity of the productive forces, with just kicking these people off of the lands, was because they were able to exploit the this new wage laboring class more intensely than the peasants, I guess, like self-exploited. But he says that that's not necessarily true. And where else does he say here? It was accompanied by improved methods of culture, greater cooperation, concentration of the means of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this was just the natural kind of upping in productivity, not necessarily because of technology, but just because it's like once you centralize these things, they just become much more productive. These things meaning agriculture, these things. And then a little bit further on, he says, with the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, and notice how he's saying it's not the entire agricultural population, right? At this point, the primitive accumulation is part of it. Once capitalism would get going, once there was a capitalist class and a wage laboring class, it would just spiral until it basically eventually absorbed everybody, which is another reason why it's like, when is the origin of capitalism? Maybe it is actually when there is a world system. I don't know. It's not, but, you know, maybe it is. With the setting free of part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free. They were now transformed into material elements of variable capital. The peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, must now buy their capital in the form of wages. And in this one, it says, in the form of wages from his new master, the industrial capitalist. So this is the stuff that blows my mind. This is the home market stuff. This is really good. I'm going to actually read a bit more before we get into it because he gives this example that's just like, oh, it's so sad. It's such a bummer. And we go to Germany, of all places, for that. So he's talking about these Westphalian peasants. I'll just highlight probably up to where we're going to go. These schmuck Westphalian peasants who, once they got kicked off of their land and in the time of Frederick II, he basically said that they all span flax. And what is spanning flax? What is spinning flax? Basically just a way of making textiles You see this a lot all over the place, obviously, in pre-capitalist, you see this a lot. This is what you see in pre-capitalist societies, people making their own clothes, right? So if you were a peasant, you made your own clothes. That's just how it was. And you did that because somebody in your house, whoever it was, might have been you, might have been your family or something like that, had the job of spinning flax and making clothes and making textiles, stuff like that. So he says these people were forcibly expropriated and hunted from the soil. That's brutal. And the other part that remained turned into day laborers of the large farmers. This is what we've seen before. At the same time arise large establishments for flax spinning and weaving. So he's basically talking about like industrial centers, right? In which the what is this? In which the people set free, again with the quotes, love it, now work for wages. The flax looks exactly the same before. Not a fiber of it has changed, but a new social soul has popped into its being. It forms now a part of the constant capital of the master manufacturer, formerly divided among a number of small producers who cultivated it themselves with their families, and with their families spun it in retail fashion. It is now concentrated in the hand of one capitalist who sets others to spin and weave it for him. That is such a bummer. Basically what he's saying here is that you weren't also like, oh, get rid of that. You, in kicking the peasants off of their land, you weren't just expropriating this peasant class into creating a new wage laboring class. Part of this primitive accumulation was also primitively accumulating new markets. And part of that was once you kicked people off of their land, they could no longer provide almost everything they needed for themselves. So you started to get capitalists providing these things for them. And just like imagine how maddening this must have been if you were just some schmuck peasant and you like got kicked off of your land. First of all, that sucks. You had to buy food now from capitalists, which is probably like shittier than the stuff you were making for yourself. And now you got to buy your clothes. And what Marx says here, I love this bit. The flax looks exactly the same as before. Not a fiber of it has changed, but now a new social soul has popped into its being. A new social soul. That's so cool. That's like why Marx is a good writer, is because just the way he's able to just phrase stuff like this. So the flax that these people are getting, the textiles, we'll just say, are exactly the same as the stuff they used to make themselves and didn't have to spend money on basically to make. But now they have to use, part of their wage to then just go buy it from some capitalist. That's lame. It's the exact same thing. They're like, I basically got this for free. All I had to do was get the flax and then spin it. So it's not necessarily free. But now it's like, now I'm getting a worse deal? I could have just made this as before. Like, yeah, I can just imagine this stuff just drove people crazy back in the day when they were like forced from their land and forced to just go and buy flax from the flax merchant. That guy was probably a real asshole. So that stuff's all excellent. And then I'm just going to skip forward again because he talks about home markets a bit more here. There's a quote in here from this guy I had never heard of, but that is very, very good. I think we're going to get to it. Is that here? Yeah. So, the expropriation and eviction of part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the laborers, but the means of subsistence and the material for labor. It created the home market. So it basically, this primitive accumulation was a primitive accumulation not just of laborers, not just of a new capitalist class, but also of this brand new home market. And so you need to find a way to create this market within the given social relations of feudalism, right? And that was basically just kind of like one movement of kicking people off of their land and then forcing them to buy the stuff that you're selling them that they were making for themselves before. The means of subsistence, which is food, the stuff that they were growing for themselves or raising for themselves, and then the clothes on their back they then had to just go and buy from some capitalists. It's relatively simple when you see it phrased like that, but when you actually think about, oh, that's what the primitive accumulation could actually be, and not just money. It's good stuff. Makes you think. Where were we here? I just lost my place. F31. So then he goes on to say, in fact, and where does this go up to? We'll just highlight a certain amount. In fact, the events that transformed the small peasants into wage laborers and their means of subsistence and of labor into material elements of capital created at the same time a home market for the latter. That's just basically him saying the exact same thing. And then he says, thus hand in hand, I'll highlight this sentence. Thus, hand in hand with the expropriation of the self-supporting peasants, with their separation from their means of production, goes the destruction of the rural domestic industry, the process of separation between manufacture and agriculture. So then this creation of a home market also creates this differentiation between productive agriculture and productive industry. It creates industry, right? And then once you get industry, then that just like, oh baby, that just like supercharges capitalism, because now you have this whole new industry, whereas before it was just a couple of schmucks making some things in a factory, not really getting by because everybody made it for themselves, probably making the stuff for export or like high quality goods, something like that on a small scale. Now it's just like, well, now you got to make stuff for everybody. You got to make means of subsistence, which is the kind of like new agricultural capitalist class. And you got to make stuff for them to wear, and then you got to make all the trinkets that they want. You got to make the boats to take this place stuff. So that's where industry comes from, right? Love that. So good. And then towards the end here of this chapter, we'll just go into the last little bit. Oh, God, he's talking about England. I'll just highlight the rest of this. On the other hand, he always finds this peasantry turning up again. This is what I was talking about peasantry always kind of coming back, although in diminished number and always under worse conditions. That's worth noticing, because when Marx says that the peasantry comes back into being, it's always much worse off than it was before. So it's like the peasantry that was there in like the previous business cycle or whatever, they had it a bit better. Now they got it a lot worse. And the chief reason for this is England is at one time chiefly a cultivator of corn. And again, corn here just means like your staple carbohydrate of choice. One second. And at another, chiefly a breeder of cattle in alternate periods. And with these, the extent of the peasant contribution fluctuates. So again, you don't need as many peasants when you're making cattle as you do when you're cultivating corn. Modern industry alone, and finally supplies in machinery, the lasting basis of capitalistic agriculture, expropriates radically the enormous majority of the agricultural population and completes, once and for all, the separation between agriculture and rural domestic industry, whose roots spinning and weaving. It tears up. It also, therefore, for the first time, conquers the industrial capital, conquers for industrial capital the entire home market. And that's where you get your boom. You got industrial capital. You're off to the races. Now, obviously, something that's not brought up here, which is brought up in one of his later chapters, which I haven't gotten to yet, is how the colonies play into all of this in the colonial system. And when Marx talks about it, is it in this chapter? Yeah, when Marx talks about it, it's pretty brutal. It's not great. And this is just another great thing where, like, Marx in Capital is really doing two things. The first thing that he's doing is being like, here's how capitalism works. I'm going to put forward this logical historical argument, blow everybody else out of the water, really make it my life's work to understand how capitalism functions. And here's how it functions. That's what capital is at first. But then there's also the second part of it, which is, and here's why that's bad, and here's why we need to move past this. Here's why it's inhuman. It's a bit more humanist, if you want to use that, excuse me, phrase. It's a bit more... It brings it back down to earth, because now you're not just dealing with industrial capitalists. Now you're dealing with like the horrors of the colonial system. And just to pick out a couple of bangers from there. First sentence. So yeah, this is chapter 31, the genesis of the industrial capitalist, where he gets in the weeds about the primitive accumulation of industrial capital as opposed to just agricultural capital. The genesis of the industrial capitalist did not proceed in such a gradual way as that of the farms of the farmer. And that's putting it mildly. This, where the agricultural primitive accumulation of kicking peasants off of their land was just this slow horror of like famine and creating this vagabond class almost. The genesis of the industrial capitalist is just like in your face slaughtering and millions of people and just genocide. So not happy stuff. This is basically the creation of the world market, and he goes in here, he talks a little bit about users' capital and merchants' capital, but we're not going to get into that right now. These are some of the quotes that I'm going to get to that you will have heard before, because these are some of Marx's more famous quotes. You hear this a lot in, I don't know if Franz Fanon like specifically uses these quotes a lot, but like in his kind of vein of trying to understand colonies and of maybe as far as like third worldism, I guess. I don't know. We're just people who are like nice and like want to understand how things actually work and understand the different experiences of different people. Um, yeah. So we'll go down to this bit. This is something that you'll almost certainly have heard before. And this is particularly brutal, so prepare yourselves. Marx says that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in the minds of its original Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and the looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa, the entire continent of Africa, into a warren for the commercial hunting of black people, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. So obviously a bit of sarcasm there. Turning an entire continent into a hunting ground for slavers, completely looting the East Indies, subjugation of entire continents, obviously, genocide of most of the population of the Americas, specifically of Northern America. This is all a process of the primitive accumulation of industrial capital. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations. So basically war between like Holland and England. So he says it begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, bloody, with the globe for a theater. Oh, sorry, I skipped that. Assumes giant dimensions for England's anti-Jacobin war and is still going on in the Opium Wars against China. These are the wars of primitive accumulation of industrial capital and what industrial capital does to the world. It is not great. So we'll scooch on just a little bit here. I think I'm just going to keep reading, actually, so we'll just highlight this stuff. The different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now more or less in chronicle order, blah, 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 blah. The methods depend in part on brute force, like the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state. Again, Marx is talking about the state. We love that. And the concentrated and organized force of society to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode and to shorten its transition. So he's basically saying that the state functions during this transition, during this time of primitive accumulation, as a way of forcing the contradictions of the previous mode into kind of the contradictions of the more recent mode of capitalism, and shortening its transition by whatever means possible. Literally will do genocide to shorten this transition, and it did. And then you get a really fascinating sentence here where he says, force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. And then he says, it is itself an economic power. So I read this today, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. And it's interesting because that's obviously been the case in transitions of modes of productions prior to what we might think about for a socialist transition, right? It's obviously true, as Marx is showing here, with the transition to capitalism. It's been true prior to that, with the state basically acting as this way of forcing these contradictions together. But I've been thinking about, like, okay, so how does this apply to a socialist transition? And obviously you could say, well, look at the Soviet Union, look at collectivization, look at all these different things that are very controversial, which I'm not going to weigh in on now. Look at the wars that had to happen, the proxy wars and the Cold War, to basically allow people this self-determination of choosing socialism, of a working class rising up. A class war is a version of this. Obviously, it's the most obvious version of force being the midwife of the transition into socialism. And I'm not denying class war here, but I think it's interesting to think about when you read some of Marx's other work. And specifically, Dan and I did an essay, or we did an episode on an essay from Shlomo Avineri's book on Marx, which is up there. And again, I'm not going to get it. Karl Marx's Social and Political Thought. And there's an essay in there all about the terror. And specifically, he uses an example of the example of the French Revolution and the terror that arose from that to talk about how Marx felt about terror during revolutionary times in general. And I came away from it with the interpretation of what Marx was saying, that terror after a revolution and during a revolution is in a way the revolution embarrassing itself, right? It's showing that, at least when we talk about socialism, that the working class isn't ready yet. And if you got to go around killing working class people for your revolution, things probably weren't right for you to materially have your little revolution or whatever. And that's why these things happen. But here it's kind of like, putting aside the entire class war thing that's going to be necessary, right? Like, how much force is necessary? How much force is necessary until you are embarrassing the revolution by showing that the working class is not ready yet? I don't know. But it's something to think about. Because obviously we're going to want to not do what the previous modal transition did, which is like genocide continents. That's not great. We don't want anything to do with that. But obviously there is going to be a little bit of pushback, shall we say, from the capitalist class if there ever is going to be a legitimate old school style working class revolt. So something to think about. I really love that sentence. And maybe for the wrong reasons, because it actually kind of makes me a bit uncomfortable. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. I wonder if Marx would actually use that phrasing to discuss the transition to socialism. Maybe not. Maybe he's just talking about historically. But again, if we don't discount class war, then it's hard to see how there won't be at least a little bit of force involved at all. And then he goes on to give some particularly brutal examples of this industrial primitive accumulation, specifically as it relates to the colonial system. And I'm not going to get too much into it now, just because it is just sad, and we know all of this stuff. We know all about the pain that the English state did, and then the American state did, literally up until the 1900s, I want to say, of just paying for heads and scalps of Native American people. This was done in California well into the 19th century. And I believe, I was going to say, I think Ishi's people were, obviously they were wiped out, so they were, what's the correct way of saying this? Something like this happened to Ishi's people because the California state government, those goddamn coastal elitists, did something similar to what Marx is talking about here, where they're basically say like $200 dues for every head of a Native American person that you bring us. Marx here ties this into primitive accumulation in a very brutal way. Again, the colonial system also ripened like a hothouse, he says here, trade and navigation. Of course, that's like how we got them building a bunch of fleets even capable of sailing around the world. This is interesting too. Today, industrial supremacy implies commercial supremacy in the period of manufacture, which I'll get to that in a sec, what he means by that. It's the opposite. Commercial supremacy gives industrial predominance. Manufacture is basically like this framing that Marx puts forward earlier in Capital to talk about the two different types of capitalism developmentally. I'm not going to get into it too much here because it is a big can of worms. But if you are interested in that stuff and how industrial supremacy kind of relates to commercial supremacy, good to read about. Actually, what chapter is that? I'll just tell you right goddamn now. Where is it? Well, maybe I'm not actually going to look for it. It's probably called something about manufacture. Yeah, it's called something about manufacture. Is that in the surplus value section? I feel like it is. Maybe it's not. Well, whatever. Look it up. Google it. And then the only other stuff that I really wanted to talk about here was the system of public credit, which is right down here. I really am interested in all of this stuff because, again, it's another thing where you're told Marx doesn't talk about it. Marx doesn't talk about money. He doesn't talk about money at all in Capital Volume 1. He's just talking about gold. But that's not true. Again, here he's talking about national debts. Blah, 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 blah. So he says national debts, i.e. the alienation of the state, whether despotic, constitutional, or republican, basically saying doesn't matter which one, marked with its stamp the capitalistic era, the only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possessions of modern people is the national debt. Excellent. Love it, Marx. Love that sentence. I'm going to read it again. The only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possessions of the modern people is their national debt. This is kind of like you always hear the socialism for the rich, right? It's like they get government handouts because the state is like an organ of class power, right? And they're helping them make profits and not necessarily helping you. They just want to make sure you survive. Anything beyond that, whatever. And in fact, they actually don't really care if you survive too much, as long as enough of us survive to keep making profit. Hence, as a necessary consequence, the modern doctrine that a nation becomes richer the more deeply it is in debt. So what he's saying here is that another part of this primitive accumulation stuff is national debt. It's this creation of the ability of the state to just go, whatever, we'll take on debt for this, and it won't really matter too much. Especially now with fiat currencies and stuff like that. The capitalists can just put their debt onto the state, whether that's for research and development or different stuff like that. Like now, literally, we were just talking with Ted Reese on the show, and he was basically saying that, you know, almost all research and development, R&D for private companies is done by the state. Now, when it comes to technology, it's not done by it's not done by the industries themselves, because that wouldn't be profitable. So this creation of the state allowing for national debt to just be heaped upon it is very important for primitive accumulation. The more you know. And that's basically about where I've gotten up to. With capital. So I've got about 20 pages to go. Just going to stop that there for now. Because it is, it's good stuff. Let me, is there a cover on this one? Let me see. Well, I don't know. I'll just do that. Yeah, why not? So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Hopefully that was helpful in some way. The primitive accumulation stuff is really interesting for having a take on the origin of capitalism, because everybody has to have their origin of capitalism take, you know what I mean? Everybody's either a Brennerite, or they're a Wallerstein person, or they're, I don't know, a Banaji person or something like that. And this is just so elucidating. It's like, just go to the source of Marx that all of these people are ostensibly talking about. They've all got their own reasons for wanting to have their, you know, I'm a Brennerite, and that's why I talk about stuff like this. Not to shit on the Brennerites. That's like the most compelling stuff I've found so far. But there is a reason that people put forward the specific theses that they do, and the way that we study, and the way that academia works under capitalism is not impartial. I'll just say that. These things are not impartial, and always go to the source. If maybe don't read about people talking about Marx first, saying what he says. Maybe just go fucking read Marx. That's what I'm trying to do. It takes a long time, though. Again, it's taking me 2 years to get through all of this stuff. It's taking me 2 years to get through all of this. Where am I at now? I am here. So 530 pages over 2 years. That's not great. That's not great, but what are you going to do? All right, I think I might call it there. I did say I was going to play some card games. I was thinking about playing a bit of Horus Heresy Legions, which is my card game of choice. But I think I might just leave it there, because that feels like a whole nother thing. So a little bit of Friday night Capital reading. I might keep doing this if stuff pops out at me. There have been a bunch of other sections, obviously, that are very, very good. Maybe I'll go back and talk about those a bit more, but for now I should probably just fucking finish Capital, is what I should do. So yeah, maybe I'll come back with these last 20 pages and do something about that. But for now, enjoy it. Dan and I will be back next week on Friday, finishing up our reading of Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital, which has been very good so far. I think we're going to have some stuff to say about it. But all in all, excellent work. I've got like 150 pages I got to read of that by like Wednesday, so hopefully I can get that done. So thank you very much, everybody, for if anybody's watching, tuned in. I might put this up on YouTube. We'll see if something like that seems easy enough to do. But until then, stay safe and enjoy your weekend, everybody, if you got a weekend, if you're not working.